Welcome to this conversation about the role of digital identity improving people's access to financial inclusion services. Around the world, over 1 billion people don't have the identity documents that help them access services, and many more can't prove their identity with verifiable documents. What this means is that they can't access financial services, but it also means that they can't access other essential services that they need to pay for. Financial exclusion through the lack of ability to prove one's identity is a real problem that we need to solve. So today we want to explore the role to which digital identity can help solve this problem. And we've got a panel of great speakers with us, with a range of expertise around the globe. Sharmista Appaya is a senior financial sector specialist at the World Bank Group, where she analyses fintech and its application to financial inclusion. She also supports governments in emerging economies to identify key regulatory and policy challenges and solutions to enable fintech products, services and business models. She chairs the Digital ID Working Group under the Financial Inclusion Global Initiative, a joint initiative of the Gates Foundation, the UN's ITU and the World Bank Group. She was the lead author on the G20 paper on digital onboarding under the Argentine presidency. And prior to joining the World Bank, she was head of the FinTech Accelerator at the Bank of England in London. Welcome. Ritesh Jain is a co-founder at the fintech startup Infinite, aimed at humanising the credit and credit card experience. He's a former COO at HSBC Digital, and he introduced Apple Pay at Visa. He's a member of the G20 Initiative for Financial Inclusion and an advisor to open banking in the EU and Africa. Welcome. Mohammed Sajjad leads UBL's digital payments across retail and transaction banking. He's also driving the enterprise transformation by crafting new digital banking business opportunities, constantly navigating through enterprise fabric with a focus on design-led innovation. He's passionate about delivering cultural change in large, complex organizations using design thinking methodologies, and his work focuses on innovation, digitalization, and how technology is redefining people's expectations, and we're delighted to have him here with us today. So welcome all. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts today and your experience on how digital ID can help improve access to financial inclusion. But before we start looking at the digital aspect of identity, let's go back to basics. Proving one's identity is really difficult. We've already heard that over 1 billion people around the globe don't have the right identity documents. And the problem around that is that it's persistent. So let's begin with the basics. How can we help people who can't currently prove their identity be able to do that? Ritesh, let me come to you first. Talk to me about identity, why it matters, and what happens when people can't prove their identity.
Thank you, Sean. It's a very interesting and powerful question, like what is the impact and why it is. The 1 billion we are talking about a couple of years back number done by World Bank, and since then it has moved. So we are making a progress, but not at the pace that we would like to see. And it's very unfortunate, even in 2021, we are talking about people without identity. At one hand, we look into the digital identity, and we are talking about the decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity. On the other hand, we have got a marginalized people around 1 billion who do not have an identity. And it is because the major factor of not having identity is uh, the migration, the displacement, the homelessness, and the poverty. And the challenge that they face, the price they pay, I generally call it poverty premium. Not having an identity, the poor is paying poverty premium. Not having an identity could be a difference between life and death for poor people because of hunger. Because governments across the globe has got multiple welfare schemes, but to access those schemes one need to have an identity. There are great examples around the globe. Some of the countries what they have done with the identities, like a great example India. As of today there are 95% people who have an identity in India, and that identity program called UID, Unique Identity Program, and it's called Aadhaar. And people are using at least once in a month. 95% people use at least once in a month. It is utilized whether you want to get a SIM card, whether you want to open a bank account. It's applicable everywhere, even in the welfare of the governments. So yes, it is critical to have an identity of a person. It is good for the economy. It is good for the financial inclusion, because the financial inclusion, the biggest barrier is the identity, is identifying person who they are. So we need to focus this more from the public policy perspective, not only from it needs a collaboration between the private and the public collaboration along with the financial institutions to focus on how we can bring people into the mainstream.
Ritesh, you raised some fascinating points that I hope we'll go on and cover through the rest of the discussion. Sharmista, let me turn to you. I know that you've worked a lot around particular niche groups, so for example, refugees, but I know that you've also got a lot of experience around the globe and thinking about this problem. What's your take on why does identity matter and who do we need to solve for?
Thanks, Sean, and thank you for inviting me here today. So, identity has always existed in some form, and there's always been a need for it. It was originally something in the social sciences, but obviously, we have now realized how important it is for financial inclusion and to gain access to the formal economy as a whole, something that's been exacerbated by COVID and COVID 19 issues. What it brings with it is the idea of sameness. It symbolizes the sameness, something remaining the same over a period of time. And this is something that's quite difficult, especially for vulnerable groups to prove. When some of the areas that we look at is things like address proof. An address of someone changes quite constantly. So it is a big exclusion risk that we, especially at the World Bank, are very concerned with. I think Ritesh mentioned some numbers of the vulnerable populations and who's been able to access and have an identity. And at the World Bank, we do this a FinDex survey that we do every 3 years, which is sort of one of the largest surveys of financial inclusion targets around the world. And the way we look at inclusion is at 3 levels. It's access to a transaction account, usage of that transaction account, and then making sure that you get the right products. So whether it's insurance or credit systems or any of the different kinds of products. And identity has a role to play in each of those 3 layers. So when we last did the Findex, which was about in 2017, the figure was 26% of the people that we'd surveyed said that they couldn't get a transaction account because they didn't have the right documentation. And we're not talking about digital documentation at all. We're talking about voter ID or ration cards or any other sort of paper ID that would normally be recognized as a national ID. So it's recognized by your national authority of it being legal. Now, the other issues that we have to deal with as we think about ID is things like demographics, cultural differences, and interestingly enough, religious beliefs as well. I remember some time ago speaking to some people from some of the authorities from Russia, and they said that none of the people wanted to have a number attributed to them because there was something, and apologies if I misquote this, but something in the Bible about numbers being attributed to people and how that sort of went against their religious beliefs. So there are so many facets of ID, and understanding sort of the globe and the universe of that is quite difficult. Now, coming back to refugees and sort of one of the most vulnerable populations, so whether they're internally displaced people as well as those sort of displaced outside, there's some pretty horrifying statistics when you read about them. So, for example, in Norway, they say at least 70% of the Syrian refugees do not have an ID of any sort. The UNHCR, which is the UN humanitarian aid organization, has done a lot of very, very good work in this space. And what they do is they actually work together with national governments, if the national governments are open to this, to help them in capacity and actually providing them an ID. Now, some of the issues with that is that sometimes that ID is not recognized in the rest of the country. It is only recognized in those refugee camps. But there have been some really good forward sort of movements made in this. And I think in Jordan recently, the UNHCR worked with the World Food Programme to create an ID, and this was a digital ID. So it was using IrisGuard, which is a UK company you might have heard of. So to use that instead of vouchers and sort of taking cash out. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. One, because a lot of the aid given to refugees is in cash. I mean, most of it is in kind, so in blankets and food, but there is a large proportion that is in cash. And to make sure the cash reaches the right people, it is very important to know, how it flows. The other important reason, which is that aid organizations need to know about funds traceability to make sure that they are still supplying aid the next year. So if you can't actually trace how the money is moving, and usually you do this through identity or quite often digital means, even though it has been done via paper trails in the past, it means that your funds for the next few years might dry up. So it has sort of much longer term consequences. So overall, I guess I'll end by saying identity is really important, and it's great that there's so much discussion around this issue. Thank you.
Sharmista, that's such a brilliant beginning for us in thinking about the complexity of it. And I really am fascinated by that concept that you've talked there about sameness, the kind of proving your sameness as a person, that you're the same person as who you say you are. Mohammed, can I come to you? So, thinking around some of the populations that you've been working with, very large numbers, huge scale, and that concept of sameness is really fascinating there. Can you share more of your experience, please, in thinking about how identity matters in a very large population?
Yeah, Sian. So let me actually start by sharing a story that I've witnessed personally in last few years. The large population that I've experienced in two countries, one in Pakistan, the other one in Myanmar, Pakistan being 220 million people and Myanmar 60 million people. Generally, the tendency is that people from rural areas tend to migrate to urban, while their families stay in the rural areas, and they come to work for to make good life in the urban areas, but they have to send money back home, and that's where using financial institutions channels, they need some sort of ID to verify them and the purpose of sending money from one place to another. And because they lack I'm particularly talking about bottom of the pyramid, they lack the access to a identity. They tend to use other means which are less documented, I would say. So as an example, one of these guys, while trying to send money back home, would make use of a bus driver and requesting him to send money while he's taking the bus to a specific route, for instance. And the fee that we have seen that these guys charge is close to 50% of the money that the poor person is trying to send back home. And there are many such examples that we have seen. And I will, as we progress in this conversation, I will share how we managed to bring that down to 5%. When I was working in Myanmar, I was one of the founding members of the Digital Financial Services, and sending money, which is the P2P, very basic transaction. We experienced a similar challenge over there. It was a country which was under lockdown for almost 40 years. And when we started offering a service where people could send money from urban areas to rural areas, we've experienced that people could not really identify themselves. And I actually want to, from those examples, I actually want to take a step back. One, and this is something that Sharmista talked about as well, having an ID does not necessarily qualify you to get access to some of these services which are dependent on electronically verifying your ID. And that's the that's the other challenge that we have seen, that despite the fact that people had a ID from a national system, since those systems in country like Pakistan were not necessarily in a decade or two ago, were not electronically linked. So it was very difficult, even if somebody is holding an ID, to verify if it is a fake ID or a real ID. And that's the challenge when you face, that those are the challenges that some of the bodies like UN, when they're dispersing funds to the deserving people in large populations, they face the challenge of transparency. One more thing that I wanted to talk about and that's the experience that we faced during COVID. 40% of the population in Pakistan is below poverty, and there were close to 24 million daily wage workers. And when government decided to disperse funds during the COVID times, it was a nightmare to, and particularly reach out to the deserving women, because of the despite of the fact that people had access to some ID, which we could verify electronically. There are other implications around the lack of education of people understanding how to present and sort of qualify themselves as holder of a ID, and that's where we have experienced the elements of frauds and to some degree the anti-money laundering as well. So yeah, those are some of the challenges that we have seen in countries with large population, with lack of digital ID, I'd say, and not necessarily ID or a electronic ID. Yeah.
Mohammed, thank you again. Some really fascinating examples that we'll hopefully pick up in the next kind of 20 minutes that we've got for the discussion. Sharmista, can I come back to you and just, I guess, ask a really difficult question, because you've seen so many examples around the globe. Where are the highlights for you? We've talked a lot about the challenges, and you've all begun to touch on some of the great work that's going on. I imagine for the people who are listening to this right now, what they really want are directions towards how to make this work, some great examples of really effective solutions. Sharmista, what would you share with us as really good examples to look at and research?
Okay, tough question. I'm going to try. So when we're looking at ID and digital ID, and I'm talking specifically for the financial sector, so not the other sectors which we know it's obviously important for, is that we need it to be legal. So that means that it's recognized by the national authorities. We need it to be unique in that you and only you have that identity. And we need it to be digital. So it is available in a digital format. Now, there are lots of different approaches in which you can do this. And I think what we don't want to do is basically say all ID needs to be digital. It's quite okay for ID to be, there's a number of countries that actually have paper-based national IDs that work very well. So I would say one of the sort of the first steps to do is to actually look at the national ID that a country has already and see if the next step is that it can potentially be digitized. The other thing to look about is partnerships and collaboration, which I think Ritesh has mentioned before as well, about how you can actually use what's available in the market to support your identity work. Now, when you look at sort of the life cycle of identity itself, there is sort of the registration, which is sort of the enrollment to get an ID. There is the issuance, so the issuance of an ID document. There's authentication and verification, which you do sort of to make sure that the ID is you, so it is who you say you are. There's authorization, and then there's the management of the ID lifecycle itself. Now, governments, I guess, need to decide where in this process they want to fit in, or which part of it do they want to do, or where do they need help. So basically, it's three things. It's basically, who are you? What can you be trusted with? And with what can I trust you? Like, how much can I trust you with? And so what a number of other countries are doing is starting small. And this is, and going back to what Mohammed said, what the FATF is doing as well is because the number of digital transactions are increasing so much. I think there's a figure that says what 60% of GDP in 2022, sorry, not last year, in 2022 will be all digital payments. So recognizing that there is so much that is digitized, there is a need to actually monitor the transactions on a digital basis. And so, which is why FATF as well, which is the Financial Action Task Force, are looking at digital ID as a way to controlling money laundering and financing terrorism. Now, to talk about it, maybe to give you just a couple of examples of some interesting cases that I've seen sort of around. We have a department within the World Bank called ID for D, which is Identity for Development. And they ran something called the Mission Billion last year, which all of us sort of contributed to, which was looking at identity solutions for the most vulnerable. And I think two solutions sort of come to mind when we think about, what can people do? One is something that was promoted by Kiva. It's called the Kiva Protocol. And what they try to do, and they're working with Sierra Leone right now, is to basically use all transactions that is in the informal sector as well to form a part of your ID. Now, so things like ID and credit data, and sort of, what you are allowed to do with the data you have is gaining a lot of traction. Sort of the use of alternate data, the use of big data, trying to find sort of trends and analysis in it. So because a lot of them, and usually you do this by, paying back my loan. So if I pay back my loan in time, my credit score goes up. But obviously for the most vulnerable of the population, this is hard to see. So the way they have defined the ID is by they take, say, a credit out at a little supermarket and then pay it back. They're allowed to take sort of almost a signature of the person who's, they've paid back to upload onto the system to basically say, hey, I've paid this back, so my credit score should go up. And like this, they collect a number of different data points, and that goes towards actually producing a digital ID for them. This is a little bit similar to, the Sesame Score in China. Of course, there's good and bad and pros and cons to all of this. But something to think about, that there are a number of different ways in which this can be done, and it doesn't always require a lot of in-depth sort of infrastructure and costs that is upfront. There's a lot that is open source and sort of consensus-based that can be done with existing solutions that are out there. The other example that I wanted to mention was the use of assisted architecture. Now, that's used in some way in the Aadhaar, where if you can't, if you don't get, you can't verify yourself, then someone who you have named as a person who's sort of close to you can verify you. So, say for example, I don't have a cell phone, and so I don't get my sort of one-time password. It can go to my father's cell phone, and he can do the verification for me. So I think based on a little bit of that, there was a group in Nigeria that came up with an identity system for those that are intellectually challenged. So the way they did it was by working with the National Identity Management Commission and actually almost building out an agency network that supported those who were intellectually challenged to gain an ID and almost verify themselves and authenticate themselves. So I guess my main point of what I'm trying to get across is that there is no one size fits all. There are different ways and you can do this, and everyone's being quite innovative about the different ways that they can come up with it, but it needs to fit the situation and it needs to be universal, are sort of the main facets of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to come straight back to Ritesh and ask you, we've just heard there so many great examples, and Ritesh, you've also worked in global corporates and also are the founder of a fintech startup. So you, I think, also have another perspective on it doesn't have to be huge. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit more, Ritesh, about the examples out there that aren't all singing and dancing. Where can you see great innovation done in a nimble,
So
agile
there's
way?
a huge innovation. Sorry, there's a huge innovation in this space because the technology is cheap and quite ubiquitously available, and that is making quite a lot of difference. So I mentioned around UID, and that is the globally the biggest database for the biometric IDs. And I would say in the ID landscape, the biometrics are proving to making a significant progress. If we look into Africa, the biometric IDs are making a difference. They started making a difference and there are multiple use cases. But let me focus on to why it is always we talk about Africa or the low income countries, right? Because that's not a challenge only for the low income countries or the Asia or Africa. That's a global challenge. If we look into UK at the moment, it's around 1.3 million people or more. we always pick up an example about the countries, right? Countries where there's a infrastructure challenge, but we never talk about the developed countries when it comes down to the identity or the financial inclusion. Especially in the UK for that matter, I can give you a very beautiful example, and which I loved it pretty much. It comes from my previous employer from HSBC. They started an initiative in Birmingham. Birmingham is one of the head office for IT for HSBC. When we have seen people around, homeless people, they started a project to give a bank to the homeless people. And that's just an example, right? And that proves that we can do something about it. We can give a transaction account to the people who do not have a valid identity. It might not be a huge use case, but it proves the point. Similarly, we can definitely do that in Africa. We can do that in lower income countries globally.
Ritesh, thank you so much for drawing attention to the UK examples, not just of great innovation, but also of the challenge. My work is all in the UK, and for the last decade, I've been working on identity, access to financial inclusion, and I couldn't agree with you more that not only do we need to talk more about the challenges in the UK, but we also need to, in the UK, recognise that there's learning around the globe that we can draw on. Mohammed, can I come back to you and ask you about something I know you're passionate about? Design thinking. We're talking about good solutions. So what can you share with us around design thinking, inclusive design, participatory approaches, all of those are kind of really important words. How can we draw on them? Where are the good examples? What can you share with us about that?
Hi, yeah, thanks for putting me on spot on this question. I'm really passionate about how design thinking can change people's lives. Going back to our experience from Pakistani market, when we as part of banking industry started looking at how we can digitize the financial services and bring more people into the inclusion, we realized that the smartphone application could in a smart application, we obviously following design thinking principles, brought in the stakeholders, and some of them were women as well. And to our surprise, as much as we thought that the smartphone application can actually help women get access to financial services without visiting financial institutions, bank branches, we realized that these women actually face two types of problems. One, the smartphone, not all of them, but some of them. By the way, 65 million smartphones we have in Pakistan among 220 million population. And we see an uptake of close to 2 million smartphones every month. And that's the latest statistics in Pakistan. What we observed is that even though some of the women in the low strata had access to smartphone, the smartphone did not have the digital ID that belonged to these women. So what happens is that the shopkeepers from where these women get access to smartphone actually include their own ID. For instance, creating Gmail or Hotmail ID versus creating an ID for these women. So that's one problem. The other problem that we identified with regards to inclusive design was the fact that most of these women have at least 2 to 3 children, and some of the children are actually very young, and while they are trying to access their transacting accounts, they are holding a children in their arms, which only allows them to access the phone with one hand. So to our surprise, instead of building a smartphone application, we actually came up with an idea, because of the design thinking principles that we followed, to give them access to financial services using feature phone, and somehow enable them maybe over a SMS interface or a USSD, which is based on keypad and simple codes for them to do P2P or a bill payment or a mobile airtime purchase. So some of the brilliant examples that I and experiences, particularly around women, that we experience, and we launch altogether a new product line to support the women belonging to bottom of the pyramid.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. And I can imagine that the people listening into this session would love to hear more examples from you. So we'll come back to that and find out where we can read and learn more. One thing that has really struck me through your comments today is both how complex digital ID is, but also that it's all about network. It's about connectivity. It's about relationships, and really it's about people being able to be trusted. And just I want to pick up on that in terms of that implies partnerships, that implies networks. Can I just come back to you and ask the question around how do you build successful partnerships? What kinds of organizations? How does it work? Who needs to be involved? You'll all have a different take on it. And so I'm particularly interested, I think, from your own experience, where have successful partnerships really helped drive forward innovation and success in this space? And what can we learn from that? Ritesh, let me come to you. You've worked in many different places and across many different organizations. Can you share with us some of your thinking and experience around what makes a successful partnership? Who needs to be involved in making digital ID work? And what can we learn and apply in our own thinking?
Thank you, Sean. Very interesting question, because no one can solve this major problem by themselves, whether it's a government or the private companies. So definitely it needs a great partnerships around, whether it's from the technology perspective or infrastructure to establish an identity. And we can pick up many examples from Africa or low-income countries where government as well as the private partnership formed to establish an identity of the people based on whether it's a telecom network, utility companies, or the social network as well. We have got many examples in Brazil where the microfinance is working based on the social network without a formal identity. So there are many cases, many examples around it. But what really matters is when these public and private partnerships are formed, one got to be careful around the policies. I would reiterate myself again, it's a public policy challenge rather than a technical challenge, rather than a financial institutions challenge. Because we have seen in many cases, it's all started with for a greater good, but at the end of the day, the marginalized who suffered the most, who have been exploited on the back of initiatives.
Thank you, Ritesh. And Sharmista, I know that you have experience of working not just with the state, but also with private and philanthropy sectors. So I'd be really interested in your view on this as well. What makes a great partnership and who needs to be involved?
So I tend to agree with Ritesh in that it is really important to get the public and the private sector to kind of work together. I think what we've seen is that the private sector have come in for a lot of different reasons to support collaborative CDD or collaborative customer due diligence. And one of the ones that we've been seeing more and more recently is the use of KYC registries. So this is a registry that's maintained together as sort of a joint forum between sort of maybe different private sector organizations that different financial sector providers can sort of query and ask for different information. So it's again coming back to the cost question. This is something that the cost is borne equally by a number of different players. Now, where we see private sector being a lot is actually working on top of the infrastructure. So the government creates the basic infrastructure to make sure that the infrastructure is sort of comprehensive, that 80% of sort of maybe the population is covered, that it's a trusted system, and that it's queryable, that you can use sort of API solutions and get answers back from it. And on top of that, we generally tend to see, and it's really interesting to see different sort of private sector players building up on top of that. India is a really good example where Google Pay is sort of built up on top of sort of the Aadhaar system, and sort of the NPCI and the UPI system. And another really interesting example is in Sweden. with something called Bank ID. Bank ID was created by a consortium of Swedish banks, and now it has been adopted by the government. There's 94% of the people that actually have access to this Bank ID. It does, it facilitates not just identity, but things such as eKYC and digital signatures. So moving towards sort of a much more digitization of the whole system. So private-public partnerships can work really well, especially as we're moving more towards sort of open source and consensus mechanisms. But as Ritesh says again, and echoing his comments, there is sort of a policy question that comes into play as well, and it's the policy question that we need to get right. Whereas the architecture and the IT as well is sort of generally tends to be available. Currently, there are even sort of what they call white label solutions that some governments are supporting to create these solutions that are almost off the shelf. That once a country wants to create a digital ID solution, they can take that sort of white label solution and customize it to their own jurisdictions. So there's a lot out there. It's sort of the other areas that there's potentially a bit of friction. Thank you.
Can I come back straight to you and ask more about the policy angle? So if we had, for example, the goal that I think we all on this call share, and probably many of the people who are listening to the discussion share, which is that people across the globe in all of the nations that we work in and on an international level can access financial services, and through being able to use access to financial services can access other essential services. That's what we want, isn't it? So Sharmista, I'm going to come straight back to you and ask, what do policymakers need to do? What is it that they can do to enable not just digital ID, but inclusive digital ID that people from all parts of society can use, and also that enables financial inclusion on a scale that we've yet to realise through other means?
So that's a really interesting question. I think one of the big issues also tends to be that I tend to work in the financial sector, and I think a lot of people on this call as well. But ID doesn't always start as a financial sector sort of regulator focus thing. So the collaboration between different regulators tends to be a little bit of a sticking point. The other things that sort of tend to be a bit of issues is things like portability, the interoperability of ID infrastructures. Now, coming back to, I think one of my fellow panelists mentioned remittances. I think it was Mohammed who mentioned remittances and actually getting sort of money across borders. How does that actually done? So that is sort of a policy question. Does an ID in sort of India work as well as, or will it speak to an ID in Pakistan? Like, how do we actually get this to work? And this cross-border sort of payments is sort of a big question that I think a number of standard-setting bodies around the globe now are beginning to think about, and we're beginning to do a little bit of work in that space. The other thing is not just the regulators being in sort of a different space, but it's also the market players. So the financial sector regulators tend to have control over the other FSPs, so the other areas that they regulate. But quite often there are players that are very outside of this, and this is sort of an issue with fintech as a whole, so outside the regulatory perimeter, that support and provide these services. So the issue is, where does the risk lie? If something goes wrong, who takes responsibility for that? And I think till we can answer those questions quite effectively, it's going to be quite hard to have sort of a universal and all-inclusive system. There's obviously a lot being done, both on redress mechanisms, using of sort of innovative technology, creating a much more integrated framework, a lot of peer-to-peer knowledge between countries. So there's a lot being done, and I think we're moving towards sort of a common goal and aim, but there is still work to be done.
Thank you. And you've highlighted a really important point, which is around the management of risk. And of course, on a national scale, payments matter enormously, financial services matter enormously. And so being able to manage risk is often the single biggest concern, I think, around both legislation and regulation. Mohammed, let me come to you and ask, so thinking about this question of what policymakers can do to enable both digital ID and greater financial inclusion through better identity, where's your thinking on this? What ask do you have of regulators, and what ask do you have of policymakers?
Yeah, interesting thing that I think I can correlate with your question is let me take you of Apple ID. So when we try to get a new Apple device, you see that it goes back to the older device and asks for permission if you are trying to get a new, logging into a new device. And that's how they keep on building their ecosystem of Apple devices, right? But in all fairness, it actually starts from an email ID which you register on Apple, and that's how you continue to build your list of devices that you make use of. And that's a simple example of how an internet ID is connected with your device ID and another service provider on internet, and they both sort of build a trust that this ID represents a person behind that digital ID. Some of the things that we have learned in our market is, as a financial industry, as much as we are offering safe and secure and trustworthy banking services, we are not as technically sophisticated as telecom operators are, and the way they have integrated into the national ID systems. So one of the partnerships that we developed was with the telecom operators, whereby they could identify a person based on the different I would say devices and the telecom subscriptions that the person had, and that actually helped us sort of build a risk-based model around authenticating and validating a person. So what I'm trying to tell you is how we sort of made the identity authentication transparent to somebody who belongs to bottom of the pyramid and not literate enough to manage and understand how their digital ID is uh, linked with some of the sophisticated financial services that banking sector offers. I think that's one of the collaboration that we've experienced in our market, where a bank is making use of the ID validation services provided by telecom operators and not necessarily a government agency per se. Yeah.
That's a great example. Thank you so much. Can I ask you now to think about policymakers? So, Mohammed, you've just given a great example about how data accessible through, I suppose, different sectors can be combined and used by different sectors to be able to enable access for people. This is, it's a brilliant example. Let's think about what you want policymakers to do. So where can policymakers really make a difference? What decisions can they make to create an enabling environment?
Let me actually draw a comparison between the two different, starkly different markets, and I've personally lived and spent a good time of my life there. One is Australia, and the other one is Pakistan. In Australia, there is this concept of a national digital ID, and all the government services are interconnected, making use of that single ID. And lately, when I was sort of migrating from Australia back to Pakistan, there was this integration between the businesses making use of that national ID, so that all the record keeping happens at a national level of different types of products and services and interactions that a individual have. In contrast to that, when I look at the services from an ID perspective within Pakistan's national ecosystem, you find out that there are a variety of IDs that an individual has. with a different set of government bodies, be it tax authorities or Security and Exchange Commission of Pakistan or other regulatory bodies. So there is an effort which is going on at a government level to consolidate and make use of sort of ID to build on top of that services like eKYC and some of the other authentication services. The challenge remains that in the large populations, since the national ID is as much as it is electronic, it is based on biometrics. That the developing countries are still struggling to make a correlation between a national ID and a digital ID per se. And it has a lot more to do with how do they structure the integration between the two, and how do they educate and make a common man aware of how the two work and sort of offer services in our day-to-day lives. So it's a journey and a learning process that a developing country follows, whereas a developed country has a few decades of advancement that they've seen. Yeah.
It's an interesting observation, because having spent the last 12 months thinking about digital ID in the UK, I actually think the UK and other developed countries are on similar learning curves. Having many legacy systems, having really powerful existing stakeholders who all have a business case and a kind of vested interest. It's a different environment, but I think the learning journey is still both essential and really challenging. But I think you've made some really important points. Ritesh, let me come to you with the same policy question. What ask should we be making of policymakers? How should they be approaching creating an enabling environment?
So the first and foremost would be around the interoperability, and that is becoming key, whether it's a developing country or the developed country, regardless of the maturity of the economies. Because I can give you a practical example. We all face a identity challenge on a day in and day out, whether we are proving our identity in form of the KYC, or a very practical example. Other day in the morning, I lost a trade because I couldn't identify myself on a trading platform, right? In time. So I lost a trade. And that's what I can ensure, and I'm pretty sure that everybody around us or who's listening, they can correlate to these sort of experiences. So it is regardless of the maturity of an economy, identity is the fundamental requirement. And now more so when it comes to the inclusion side, the financial inclusion part, it is the basic requirement. Now the matter is how we can make this work for the people. We have been talking about G2P for a couple of decades now, the government to person payments, and that is the basic starting point to establish an identity of the people and bring them into the financial mainstream. But unfortunately, there are as many forces are in the favor of bringing the identities in place as well as bring people into the financial inclusion. But there are some forces which have been over a period of time were working against it, right? When we talk about the policy making, let me throw some light on M-Pesa for that matter. We all talk about M-Pesa significantly. It has brought a revolution in Kenya, 10% population into the mainstream financial services. Great. But nobody talks about on the darker side of M-Pesa, which has given a power into the hands of agent or the people to exploit this community. So that's why the policy is really key while you are building up these systems, because they will have a significant impact onto the marginalized people. And they are already suffering. Uh, Microfinance, for that matter, have been built up to support people, but microfinance have been utilized as a tool or means to exploit marginalized people because of the APRs, higher interest rates. And I wouldn't want to go far. Let's take an example about UK, right? It's It's really surprising when we talk about the disparity in the interest rates in the UK from 3% of personal loan to 24 to 36% credit card to 1500% APR on payday loans. Here we are talking about the developed country, right? And that's where the challenge is. So we really need to focus on the policy. And when we think about the policy, we need to think about the inclusivity of all the sectors and how it is going to work for everybody.
Oh, Ritesh, I can't disagree with anything that you've just said. As a kind of an advocate for the increased access to affordable finance in the UK, I yeah, I'm of the same mind. So for me, financial inclusion is about empowerment. And Ritesh, everything you've just said there makes me think of Muhammad Yunus. It makes me think of Amartya Sen. It makes me think of development as freedom and financial inclusion, microfinance as empowerment and inclusion and liberation tools, actually. So my final question to each of you, I want to put the power into your hands. Imagine you could make anything happen. You could make any change happen. You could make anyone do anything. What one thing do you really wish that you had the power to change? I'm going to start with Sharmista. What's your wish?
Thanks, John. I'd probably say I'd want identity to be portable, or interoperable, so different identity systems be able to speak to each other.
Fantastic. Thank you. Really clear. Mohammed, let's come to you next.
Yeah, I, I have sort of conflicting thoughts here. On one side, I am really for a digital identity, and coming from different, countries' experiences, I can tell you that it has far-reaching benefits. But at the same time, the way I see um underserved people getting exploited because they're not educated and literate enough to understand how to make use of digital IDs. I really hope and wish that the in parallel to how digital identities are shaping up in developed and developing economies, there is at the same time equal amount of effort of educating and hand holding people so that they're not exploited and and they don't lose trust on these systems. And that's how they try to keep themselves away from some of these sophisticated concepts. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, a really important kind of note of caution that as we've discussed today, digital ID is a tool and it can be used for good or bad. So how do we make sure that the data is portable, but that when it's used well and it's used for great outcomes? I think that's that has absolutely got to be at the heart of what we're trying to achieve. Ritesh, let me come to you with the same question. If you had the power to change anything, what would it be?
I would like people to have access to their ID and they need to own their ID. So whether you talk about the distributed digital identity or the self-sovereign identity, and that's where I would like to see people have that power. But before that, I would completely agree to Mohammed and Sharmista in terms of the interoperability as well as the education. People need to understand what it really means for them.
Thank you. So our three takeaway kind of goals then: interoperability, ownership by the individual, and not only the tool itself, but the support and skills support to be able to use the tool well for our own development. I think that's a fantastic set of goals. So, interestingly, the discussion we've had today, we've only been able to scratch the surface of digital ID and the role of digital ID in financial inclusion. I just want to give you an opportunity, if there's anything you want to pick up on before we finish, just to, one last thought. if there's anything that we've missed that is really important for the discussion today, that you want those listening to hear and take away. Mohammed, I can see you want to come in.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to something very important and crucial at this point in time, which is FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. They are putting in measures in place to avoid and safeguard the world from terrorism, and through the appropriate protocols around anti-money laundering and counterterrorism actions. And behind all of this is, in all fairness, the single concept of how do you identify an individual. And that's where the national electronic digital ID comes into play to help particularly financial institutions identify a customer from a due diligence point of view, know your customer, and enhance due diligence wherever it is required. So, the concept of digital ID is now going beyond the boundaries of a country, and it is becoming global. And that's where it is much more, I would say, need of the hour that countries as well as governments and global forces make sure that appropriate ID and identity systems which are interoperable are in place to identify a human being and see how we can financially include as well as safeguard their interests.
Thank you so much. Sharmista, I just want to give you one opportunity as well, and if there's anything that you think that we've either missed or not covered in enough detail, anything that you want us to take away.
I would probably say the only thing, maybe the two things that we probably didn't have time to cover because we've covered a fair bit of ground, is the levels of assurance, and this is something that the FATF also talks about. It's about saying, depending on what you need access to, the amount of verification you need to do on your identity needs to be different. So for a basic transaction account, you don't need that much sort of verification. For more services, maybe if you're taking out a loan, you need more. So the levels of assurance and the levels of verification is something that maybe we can touch upon at another time. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that there's, every time I speak to a number of fintechs, there's so many exciting new methods that they've come up with for doing identity checks. It's things like move your head so we can have sort of a likeness check, or identity on the blockchain, or lots of people creating sort of open source identity networks that can be taken off the shelf. So I think, again, time for another conversation, but all the innovative ways in which identity is actually being developed and sort of pushed out. Thank you.
Yeah, some really important points. Ritesh, a final opportunity for you. Anything that we've not covered or that you really want us to take away?
Thank you, Sean. So we have covered a surface of the financial inclusion and that identity, but I would really like to, as a last opportunity, I would like to talk about the DID, the distributed digital identity, and the open banking, because we are seeing a growth in the open banking across the globe, and it's an inimitable combination, because the open banking is again just a surface. We are just starting at the moment. It is only limited to the accounts and the payments, but we are looking into the future, that is open finance, and definitely we need an interoperable distributed digital identities to make it successful. So yes, that is the future.
Thank you. Sitting in London and thinking about financial inclusion and the fact that we still require people in the UK to go through the hurdles of a passport or a photo driving license and 3 months worth of utility bills in order to be able to open a bank account. And then here we are having a conversation from around the globe around solving for identity, solving for digital ID. there is so much that we have to learn from each other, and I'm so grateful to you all today for sharing your expertise, for sharing your thinking, and also for setting challenges, you know, for us as a sector, for policymakers, for international organisations, for investors, and for innovators. And I'm so grateful to you all. It's been a fantastic conversation. I hope that those listening in today will have found it really useful. And I look forward to following up with you each in the future. Thanks. Have a lovely day.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Sean. Have a
Thank
lovely
you.
day.